So what I want to talk about tonight is what was the Free Religious Association and why does it matter? The FRA. Most people haven't heard of it, but it was very important to the development of humanism and secularism in general. And it's very important, as we'll see, to the development of what has come to be called spiritual but not religious. So there's a common misperception about what we do at FUS and in humanism, which is that we are ahistorical, that we don't care anything about the history of religions or philosophies, that we are traditionless ourselves, that we don't have a tradition, and that we just don't think about things in a theological way that has any complexity to it. All of those are incorrect. It's just that the tradition that I'm going to talk about tonight is very, very, very little known. There are some dissertations out there on it. The easiest way into the consideration of what happened after the Civil War and before the First World War in the US is a book I've mentioned before, Restless Souls, The Making of American Spirituality by Lee Eric Schmidt. Lee Eric Schmidt is the, I think, the dominant and best scholar at secularism after the Civil War. And he's working into our own time now, and he's gotten into the 1920s at this point. Another book that just came out, and I've only read a little bit of it, is The Religious Revolution, The Birth of Modern Spirituality, 1848 to 1898. So far, I'm liking the book. It begins in 1848 because that is the year of the great unrest and revolutions in Europe, and also the year that Ralph Waldo Emerson toured Europe with his ideas. And so there was suddenly this melding of Marxism and the developing socialist ideas and the developing transcendentalist ideas with then German Romanticism, which was by this time relatively agey, but suddenly you have these two strains really hitting each other. So I'm looking forward to reading this book. An older book, but one that I like a lot, is A.N. Wilson's God's Funeral. He's a British scholar. As you can see from the title, he thinks that God is dead and Nietzsche was right, and he's tracing basically mostly British Victorian responses to that. But it's a very good book. It's just that he's one of those who thinks that religion is dead. Well, you can see that because he's British, but in the US, things look considerably different. But Thomas Hardy was one of those people who really kind of mourned the death of God as he saw it. And he did write a long poem called God's Funeral around 1910 or so. And just to share some verses of how he was feeling about it. How sweet it was in years far hide. Well, I should mention that he's seeing God's funeral. They're carting God to the graveyard here, right? And the scholars and the artists are all, in the funeral train, but there are some dissenters. So how sweet it was in years far gone, right? One thing about Thomas Hardy, even though he's a modernist in his novels, in his poetry, he's very, very traditional and Victorian. So how sweet it was in years far hide to start the wheels of day with trustful prayer, to lie down liegely at the eventide and feel a blessed assurance he, should be capital He nowadays, was there, God, right? And who or what shall fill his place, whither all wanderers turn distracted eyes for some fixed star to stimulate their pace towards the goal of their enterprise. Some in the background then I saw, sweet women, youths, men, all incredulous, who chimed as one, this figure is of straw, this requiem mockeries, still he lives to us. And what Hardy is seeing is his own intellectual artist loss of God, and that the poorer, more or less educated folk are still believing in God, but alas, they too will probably be soon following in the funeral train. It's the general idea. So This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now it's called itself Britannica because it's online. Britannica, although Transcendentalism divided the Unitarians, Henry Whitney Bellows, a prominent figure in Unitarianism after the Civil War, he was a real corporate man kind of thing. He liked making everything very organized. He was in the war, he was the head of the sanitary division that was trying to figure out how to stop people from dying. You know, as you know, almost as many people died of disease and infections as of actual wounds. So a prominent figure in Unitarianism after the Civil War, he organized the National Conference of Unitarian Churches in 1865. A separatist free religious association was organized in 1867 by persons who, although holding a variety of views, were agreed in their opposition to the preamble of the National Conference's Constitution, which was virtually a Christian creed. In general, the Unitarians in those days would say the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Right, the idea that there was definitely a deity, and that deity had a lot to do with the good old-fashioned Christian idea of what a God happened to be. So, also the Western Conference, and this becomes very important in Unitarian Universalism later, which was based in Chicago. The Western Unitarian Conference, organized in 1852, also experienced controversy over whether Unitarianism was to include persons whose views were not theistic and Christian. In 1894, a revision occurred in the National Conference, and so the FRA could reunite because they dropped the Christian and most of the deistic language in it. And that is what becomes the AUA, the American Unitarian Association, in 1925, that becomes the UUA that we all know and love today. So that's the kind of way that it worked after the American Civil War. Previous to that, it had only been individuals who belonged to any kind of Unitarian organization, not actually congregations, and the individuals had to be ministers. So it was a very white guy, educated Harvard guy, insiders club up until the Civil War. And then it began to shift a little bit, but not that much. Okay. Again, from the Britannica. In the 20th century, religious humanism, the endeavor to reformulate liberal theology on strictly non-theistic grounds, emerged within Unitarianism, leading to a theist-humanist controversy. That's where they tried to kick Dietrich and Curtis Reese out, but they didn't manage it because other ministers did support them. And so after the Unitarian ministers, John Dietrich, Curtis Reese, signed the Humanist Manifesto in 1933, religious humanism became the view of many, actually, I would say most Unitarians after 1933 and up through the 1970s, and arguably still yet today. So when we talk about that, even the president of the UUA today admits that most Unitarian Universalists are humanist in their viewpoint. And again, how did we get there is kind of the question. So back to the Free Religious Association, 1867. Several people that we probably haven't heard of, and a few that you have, were the originators of this. So David Atwood Wasson, who was a poet and a disciple of Emerson, Lucretia Mott, one of those early women who really forged the women's suffragist movement. She insisted upon speaking in mixed crowds of men and women, which was forbidden by the Unitarians in the day. But she stood up and said, we're going to do that. She was an abolitionist before the war, a pacifist, a religious seeker in general. She went all the way from Quakerism to Unitarianism to freethinkerism in her life as she went along, because she was simply insistent that women were as good and as smart as men, and she just kept bouncing off that wall. She was one of the Seneca Falls people who were involved in that. And then the Reverend William J. Potter, who was a Unitarian. And to be in Potter's words, this group is going to be a spiritual anti-slavery society. All of the people who were forming this most of them had been abolitionists. So they knew the excitement and the power, and they had won that one to get the slaves at least free. And so they wanted to do that with religion as well. And so that's the vision that starts the Free Religious Association, to emancipate religion from the dogmatic traditions it had been previously bound to. And so that's the idea that's going to go on here. So who joined it immediately? Progressive Quakers, liberal Jews, radical Unitarians, Universalists, agnostics, free thinkers, spiritualists, and we think, wow, that's weird. But right after the Civil War, spiritualists were considered to be scientifically contacting the dead. And of course, there was a lot of reason to do that, that so many people had lost relatives in the war, and they really wanted to talk to their dead kinfolk. And I mean, one of the things is even, Arthur Conan Doyle, at the end of the 19th century, is still, even though he's a scientific thinker and he has, his Sherlock Holmes being a scientific thinker, still yet, he really kind of believes it, and then he kind of doesn't believe it. And so it goes back and forth. So that's one of the weird things that happen. Some of you know the history of Universalism is that many Universalist churches voted to leave the organization and to become spiritualist churches. And that was one of the reasons that the Universalism began to decline very sharply after the Civil War. And then something called scientific theists that I'll be talking more about. That is people who believe that science and theism were not incompatible. And as we'll see, I mean, there are some folks like that today. So famous members. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the first president. He was, of course, the man who had essentially invented liberal non-sectarian religion before the war. And so he was the grand old man who was, many people followed and believed that, very specifically. Frederick Douglass, a religious freethinker. Most people don't know that about him. And Felix Adler, who later forms the Ethical Culture Societies. An odd one is Robert Dale Owen, who was a workers' rights advocate. He also was a spiritualist. He's the guy who bought the whole town of New Harmony, Indiana, and tried to form a commune there. So he left fairly early because, again, spiritualism was kind of suspect all the way along. They really couldn't figure out, especially after two sisters who claimed to talk to a particular dead person. They found the body of this dead guy in their basement, right? So that's a little suspect, sisters, right? And then Charles Eliot Norton, a Harvard professor, a social activist. He is one of the relatives of T.S. Eliot, by the way. Somebody who's really unjustly not known nowadays in general American thought is Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was a Unitarian minister. He was one of the financial backers of John Brown, and therefore would have been hanged had they found that out during the time. He was a decorated and wounded Civil War veteran, a publisher very involved with the Atlantic magazine, and a translator. He translated Marcus Aurelius, for example, and the literary supporter of Emily Dickinson. Probably his greatest contribution to American culture was the fact that Emily wrote him letters, and he got the only poems that she had published in her lifetime, he got them published. And he was willing to put up with her because, he would go visit her in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she always sat around the corner. He had to sit in the parlor drinking his tea, and she was around the corner in another room where he couldn't see her. But he was willing to put up with that eccentricity, and because he understood way ahead of anybody else that she was absolutely the literary genius of American poetry. So a great guy, and also a Unitarian minister who went into free thought, what we would nowadays consider to be humanism. Then there's Francis Ellingwood Abbott, again, unjustly forgotten. He was a Unitarian minister, a free thinker, and he was the founder of the Liberal League, 1876 to 1885, which was the precursor of First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. He forms the Liberal League, and the Liberal League says we must keep the separation of church and state. That is central to American democracy, and we can't have democracy without total freedom of religion, and that goes both ways. Government doesn't get involved with religion, but also religion doesn't get involved in government. Now, the interesting thing about him is he always was, till his death, a scientific theist. So he says this, for example, God is as near to you and me as he ever was to Moses, Jesus, or Paul. Now, those of you who know the opening words to Emerson's essay, Nature, know that that's almost a direct quote, actually. Anyway, it goes on to say, wherever a human soul is born into the love of truth, there is the Holy Land. Wherever a human soul has uttered its sincere faith in the divine and thus bequeathed to us the legacy of inspired words, there is the Holy Bible. And so you get the whole program that he's going for. Everybody's a prophet. Everybody is sacred. Everybody can write sacred scripture. But he did believe that there was a God and that science would prove that God. Scientific theism, as they called it then, becomes later what we process theology is what most people call it nowadays, and it still exists among a lot of people. The impeachment of Christianity. So he's a theist, but he thinks Christianity is a bug in amber, right? It's just an old antique that's cute there on the shelf, but it has nothing to do with the way we live nowadays. And there are some books about him, but as I say, I think he's kind of unjustly forgotten in the history of especially secular and humanist thought. And someone, again, I think, who's very sadly forgotten is Moncure Conway. He begins as a Methodist minister, becomes a Unitarian minister, then becomes a free thinker. He's the only descending of a founding father to physically aid slaves in escaping to their freedom. So that kind of says a lot about, his power and position, his social standing, but the guy had guts, right? Here in the US, he's pretty well forgotten, but he did move to England for a while, and there is a Conway Hall in London that still does humanist and ethical culture stuff, but it's mostly a classical concert venue nowadays. But again, Moncure Conway, unjustly forgotten, gutsy fellow. So I'll go back to the Britannica just a moment. It was opposed not only at the FRA to organized religion, but also to any supernaturalism in an attempt to affirm the supremacy of individual conscience and individual reason. The FRA carried a message of the perfectibility of humanity, democratic faith in the worth of each individual, the importance of natural rights, and the affirmation of the efficacy of reason. Sounds kind of like the 7 principles of the UUA in some ways, and it sounds a lot like what we still talk about at First Unitarian Society today. They did last for some time, but the main thing to remember about the FRA was that it was individuals who belonged to it, just as had been the older Unitarian organization. There weren't any groups that belonged to it. And so what did they do every time they met but argue over theology, even though their big thing is, we accept your theology, right? Yeah, but we're going to sit here and argue about it. It's kind of like socialist meetings, in the early 20th century. I'm purer than you are in my thought, unfortunately. Well, where does all of this come from? Well, it comes from Emerson, as I mentioned, and Emerson comes to this belief after 1848. He has this to say in one of his lectures: the world may be reeled off from any one of its laws like a ball of yarn. A chemist can explain by his analogies the processes of the intellect. the physician from his, the geometer from, and the mechanician from, respectively, from theirs. In other words, all knowledge is a ball. You get the string of the yarn and you start pulling and you run into all the other knowledge. And this was a basic belief for Emerson. He also says this is from a lecture called Natural Religion that he wrote in 1867. He wrote this: "We know that the world was made at one cast. What we find in ourselves, we recognize all around us. Whatever man sees, that he has a key to in his own mind. The religious impulse is the most revolutionary principle in human experience, uplifting and impelling the man beyond himself. Every nation of the globe is in our day, whether willingly or reluctantly, holding up its sacred books and traditions to our eyes, and we find in our mythology a key to theirs, and in our experiences a key to their experience." So you get the idea. All knowledge is leading to basically the same ideas, and all religions are equally open to our human understanding as we go through it. All right, so that's what he calls natural religion. I would argue that natural religion, as Emerson saw it, is what we nowadays call spiritual but not religious. He didn't see how it would turn out, and the technologies have changed. But there are some similarities. Number one, it's transhistorical, not unhistorical, but transhistorical, meaning that we look at the Tao from 2,000 years ago. We look at Confucianism. And all of human philosophy and religion is now open to us, and that he saw that coming. Because, we had the train going on, you had the telegraph coming in, you had steamships crossing the ocean, you had the British Empire pulling in information from everywhere. And so he saw this coming. Also, he saw religion had to be non-institutional. Why? Because how can you have an individual conscience if you have an institution telling you how to think? Now, of course, Dietrich thought he solved that problem, but that's another story. And then religion, spirituality had to be based, as Emerson saw it, on ethics as first principles. That is that, no, a God is not telling us what to do. That has never happened, but our consciences tell us what to do. And so we follow virtuous actions. We don't steal other people's wallets, generally. Most people don't. Why don't they? It's not because of the 10 Commandments. It's because inborn in us, Emerson thought, was an idea of morality. I need to be fair to other human beings. So again, this is still argued today. You can't be moral without a God, blah, 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 blah. But Emerson's ideas led directly to the ethical culture movement of Felix Adler in the 1870s and to the humanism of John Dietrich in the 1910s that came to First Unitarian Society in 1916. I mentioned this book because I just asked for a review copy yesterday by a young man. He's he looks like a kid, but I think he's in his 30s. He has his PhD. And he just has published a book called God the Created, Pragmatic Constructive Realism in Philosophy and Theology. I don't recommend reading that unless you're really interested in theology, but the beat goes on, in other words. Process theology. Is there a scientific theism? Can there be a theism even if you don't believe in theism? Blah, blah, blah. And these arguments just go on and on. Pragmatic, constructive realism in philosophy and theology. And yes, there's going to be a conference on that book at the next meeting of the American Religious Society National Conference next year. So there you go. So the Free Religious Association was an organization of individuals. That's very important to remember. Do we need a new version of the Free Religious Association today? And I go back and forth about this question myself, because we do have something called the Secular Coalition. The UU Humanists, I was on the board for a long time. We sent a representative to their meetings each year. Secular Student Alliance, Humanistic Judaism, Secular Women, the Clergy Project, that more than one of the FUS members have been part of as evangelical ministers who became atheists and humanists. Ex-Muslims, Free Thought Society, Freedom from Religion Foundation, the American Ethical Union, that's ethical culture, American Humanist Association, Black Non-Believers. FUS has been instrumental in trying to aid that organization. Camp Quest, which we have sent kids to, and on and on. But this then is an organization of organizations attempting to pull together our still, alas, small movement. Yet despite all attempts to the contrary, secular organizations remain small and often disconnected from each other. Is that merely the nature of the beast that is secularism? And that is the question that we do have to leave us with. Can we ever get ourselves together? Because they couldn't do it. Secular Coalition hasn't been able to do it. We remain this group of tiny organizations who keep arguing. And frankly, First Unitarian Society is kind of the big one in the room to a lot of it, because we have bricks and mortar, and actually most of those organizations do not. And so we are very much still in the condition that they were back in 1867. And I will stop the recording.